But your experience hasn't been a straight line. It's been a loop. You move forward in visible ways. You get smarter, more self-aware, more capable. From the outside, it looks like progress, but internally, the same emotional pressure keeps resurfacing. Different circumstances, same tension. You might feel like you're always compensating for something you can't quite name, always proving, adjusting, anticipating, always carrying an invisible responsibility that no one explicitly gave you, but that you feel compelled to hold anyway. You might feel older than people your age, or disconnected from people who seem lighter, more instinctive, less burdened by reflection. You might envy their ease while also judging it. You might feel like you're constantly monitoring yourself, watching your reactions, editing your responses, trying to stay one step ahead of your own impulses, as if something inside you can't be trusted to act freely without consequences. And yet, when you finally do let go, when you act without overthinking, it rarely feels safe. Relief is followed quickly by guilt, regret, or the sense that you've exposed something you were supposed to keep contained. So you tighten back up. This isn't dramatic. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself as trauma or crisis. It's quieter than that, more structural, like a subtle misalignment that makes every emotional movement cost a little more effort than it should. You've learned to live with it. You've built an identity around managing it. But there's a moment, usually alone, usually unplanned, when you wonder why life feels heavier for you than it seems to for others. Why insight hasn't translated into relief. Why knowing yourself hasn't made you feel more at home inside yourself. You might have blamed your upbringing, or timing, or specific relationships, or your temperament. All of those explanations are partially true. None of them reach deep enough. Because this isn't just about what happened to you. It's about how you adapted. Long before you could explain yourself, you learned a way of being that kept you oriented in the world. A way of responding. A way of staying safe, seen, or necessary. It worked well enough that it became invisible, automatic. You didn't choose it consciously. You inherited it through experience, repetition, and emotional memory. It shaped what you notice, what you expect, what feels normal. That's why walking away from familiar pain feels harder than staying in it. That's why peace sometimes feels suspicious. That's why you can sense when something is about to repeat, but still find yourself stepping into it anyway. There's a structure beneath your choices, not fate, not destiny, structure, like a blueprint you didn't draw, but have been living inside of for as long as you can remember. You can renovate parts of it, you can change the furniture, but the load-bearing walls remain untouched unless you know where they are. Most people never look for them. They stay busy. They stay distracted. They tell themselves stories that keep the discomfort manageable. You didn't fully succeed at that. The feeling kept breaking through. That's not a weakness. It's a signal. The unease you've been carrying isn't random. The repetition isn't coincidence. The sense of being slightly misaligned with your own life isn't a personal failure. There is a pattern here, and it was present long before you had language for it. The pattern doesn't announce itself all at once. It reveals itself slowly, across years, through situations that feel unrelated on the surface. Different people, different environments, different versions of you. But the emotional outcome is familiar enough that, if you're honest, you can predict it before it fully arrives. You've noticed this. There's a moment early on when something new begins, where a quiet tension appears alongside the excitement. You tell yourself it's just nerves, or caution, or maturity. You've learned not to trust ease too quickly, so you adjust, you adapt, you show up in a way that feels responsible, thoughtful, controlled. And for a while, it works, until it doesn't. Eventually, the same internal friction returns, the same sense of being slightly out of position, the same emotional labor that seems to fall disproportionately on you, the same exhaustion that comes not from what you're doing, but from how much of yourself you're holding back or reshaping to keep things stable. When you look back, the story repeats with unsettling consistency. You become the one who understands more, the one who accommodates, the one who anticipates problems before they happen, the one who carries emotional weight quietly, because making it visible feels like a risk. Sometimes you're the fixer, sometimes the observer, sometimes the one who holds everything together until there's nothing left to hold. The roles change. The function stays the same. You've tried to break the cycle through effort, through willpower, through choosing better people, healthier dynamics, more aligned paths. You've set intentions. You've made lists. You've promised yourself you won't end up here again. And still, somehow, you do. Not because you didn't try hard enough, but because effort doesn't touch the layer where this pattern lives. This is the part that frustrates you most, even if you don't say it out loud. You've done the work you were told would help. Reflection, boundaries, awareness. You can articulate your tendencies clearly. You can explain what you should do differently next time. Yet when the moment arrives, something else takes over. It's not a conscious decision. It's a pull, a gravity toward what feels familiar, even when that familiarity carries cost. You recognize it only in hindsight, when the emotional landscape starts to look eerily similar to the past. That's when the doubt creeps in. Maybe this is just how you are. Maybe growth has a ceiling. Maybe some people are built to carry more weight than others. Those thoughts don't come from nowhere. They come from repetition without resolution. Because repetition teaches the nervous system faster than insight ever could. Each time the pattern completes itself, it reinforces an internal expectation. This is how things go. This is where it leads. This is what happens when you open up, when you commit, when you try. And so, even when you want something different, a deeper part of you prepares for the familiar outcome. You brace, you manage, you subtly steer situations toward what you know how to survive. That's the part most people miss. The pattern doesn't persist because you enjoy it. It persists because it once kept you safe. At some point, often early, often quietly, you learned that certain emotional positions were dangerous, too exposed, too needy, too disruptive. You learned that staying slightly restrained, slightly vigilant, slightly responsible reduced risk. So you internalize those positions as normal. You didn't just experience life that way. You organized yourself around it. That organization now operates beneath conscious choice. It shapes what feels attractive, what feels threatening, what feels like home. This is why telling yourself to choose differently has never been enough. Choice happens at the surface. The pattern lives underneath. You can think of it like this. Before you decide what to do, a deeper system has already decided what feels tolerable, what feels familiar, what feels survivable. That system doesn't care about your goals. It cares about continuity. And continuity, for it, means repetition. That's why breaking the pattern feels disorienting rather than liberating at first. New responses don't feel empowering. They feel wrong, exposed, unsafe in ways you can't logically justify. So you retreat, not all at once, not consciously, but through small adjustments that slowly guide you back into known emotional territory. You might call this self-sabotage. That word is too simple. It implies intent. This isn't sabotage, it's preservation. The pattern existed before the choice, before the relationship, before the career move, before the realization that something wasn't working. It's been quietly arranging the conditions of your life for a long time. And that's the unsettling part. If this pattern predates your conscious decisions, then effort alone was never meant to break it. Awareness alone was never meant to dissolve it. You've been trying to solve a structural issue with surface-level tools, which is why the feeling keeps returning. Because the source hasn't been addressed. And it won't be addressed by fixing behaviors alone, or by finding the right circumstances, or by understanding yourself a little better next time. The pattern isn't a mistake, it's a map. And until you know where that map comes from and how it was written, you'll keep mistaking repetition for failure instead of recognition. There comes a point where explanation stops being comforting. You've reached it before. That moment when psychological language starts to feel thin, when personality labels feel too general, when insight feels accurate but incomplete, like it describes the shape of the problem without touching its source. You know yourself well enough to feel when something is missing. What's missing is structure, not structure as in discipline or routine. Structure as in architecture, the underlying framework that organizes how you experience effort, attachment, safety, desire, and meaning before you ever make a decision about them. This is where most people turn away, because structure implies limits. It implies inheritance. It implies that not everything about you was chosen. And that is uncomfortable in a culture built on the idea of reinvention. Astrology enters here, not as belief, not as prediction, and not as comfort, but as a symbolic language for psychological architecture, a way of describing how energy organizes itself through a person, how tendencies cluster, how certain tensions repeat with precision that random explanation can't fully account for. You were likely taught to think of astrology as something external, something applied to you, a description placed on top of your life. That's backwards. A birth chart is not about what will happen to you. It's about how you orient yourself toward what happens. It doesn't tell you events. It describes pressure points. It doesn't define outcomes. It defines defaults. The reason this matters is because defaults operate silently. You don't feel them as choices. You feel them as, this is just how I am, or this is what feels normal, or this is what I always end up doing. That's where astrology becomes unsettlingly precise. A chart is a map of internal gravity. It shows where attention collapses inward, where effort feels compulsory, where avoidance feels safer than engagement, where responsibility arrives before desire. Not because the planets cause these traits, but because the chart captures a moment of pattern alignment, a snapshot of how structure imprinted itself into form, into you. This isn't mystical, it's symbolic. Symbols don't predict, they reveal. When you look at a chart through this lens, certain things begin to make uncomfortable sense. Why some emotional tasks feel heavier for you than for others. Why certain themes repeat regardless of context. Why you can succeed externally while feeling internally misaligned. The chart doesn't say, this will happen. It says, this is where tension concentrates. For some people, tension concentrates around safety. For others, around worth. For others, around control, visibility, abandonment, or responsibility. These concentrations shape identity long before language does. You didn't decide where yours would be. That doesn't mean you're trapped by it, but it does mean it won't dissolve through optimism. Astrological mechanisms describe how these concentrations form. Houses show where life demands engagement. Signs show how that engagement is expressed. Planets show what kind of psychological function is involved. Aspects show where those functions conflict, amplify, or suppress each other. You don't need to memorize terminology to understand the effect. Think of it this way. Your psyche has regions that are overdeveloped and regions that feel underlit. Areas where you are hyper-aware. Areas where you are strangely disconnected. Areas where effort feels constant. Areas where rest feels unsafe. Those distributions are not random. They create a personality that feels consistent over time, even as circumstances change. They explain why you can move cities, change relationships, alter careers, and still find yourself facing the same emotional equations. The chart shows the equation, not as destiny, as tendency. This is where astrology separates from comfort narratives. It doesn't tell you that everything happens for a reason. It doesn't promise balance. It doesn't assure you that you're meant for ease. What it offers instead is recognition. It shows you that the parts of yourself you've been fighting were never errors. They were responses to an internal structure that asked certain things of you earlier and more intensely than others. You might see why responsibility arrived before freedom, why emotional containment preceded expression, why vigilance became familiar, why rest had to be earned. These are not personality quirks. They are structural responses. And once you see them that way, something shifts. The question stops being, "What's wrong with me?" It becomes, "What has this structure been asking of me all along?" That question is dangerous in a quiet way, because it removes moral judgment, it removes self-blame, and it removes the fantasy that you could have simply chosen your way out of this. It also removes excuses, because structure doesn't absolve responsibility, it clarifies it. Astrology doesn't say you can't change. It says change requires working with architecture, not against it. You don't heal a building by pretending the load-bearing walls aren't there. You don't create stability by demolishing what holds everything up. You learn where the weight travels. You learn what can be altered and what must be supported differently. That's what the chart reveals, where the weight has always been. Once you understand that, your past stops looking like a series of personal failures and starts looking like a coherent response to invisible demands. You see why certain choices felt inevitable, why certain sacrifices felt necessary, why certain tensions never fully resolved. You were operating inside a design you didn't know how to read, and now, for the first time, you're beginning to see its outline. This doesn't bring relief yet. Recognition rarely does at first. What it brings is a deeper unease, the kind that comes when something finally starts making sense, and you realize it was never as simple as you hoped. The chart doesn't comfort you. It confronts you with a more precise question, not who you are, but what you've been built to carry. Every structure leaves a mark, not a visible one, not something you could point to and name as damage, more like a subtle distortion that shapes how you move through the world without announcing itself as an injury. This is the invisible wound. It isn't a single event. It's not a moment you can circle and say, "That's when it happened." It's a pattern of adaptation that formed before you had the option to question it, before you had language, before you understood that there were other ways to be. You didn't choose it. You learned it. Early on, you sensed something about your environment that required adjustment. Maybe it was instability, maybe unpredictability, maybe emotional absence or emotional excess. Maybe you learned that attention came with conditions, or that safety depended on staying alert, useful, composed, or quiet. Whatever the specifics, your system responded intelligently. It figured out how to survive. The chart doesn't record the story itself. It records the strategy. This is where people misunderstand what an astrological wound actually is. They imagine it as trauma encoded in symbols, or fate disguised as psychology. That misses the point. The wound isn't what hurt you. The wound is how you reorganized yourself to prevent being hurt again. That reorganization becomes identity. You may have learned to read rooms quickly, to anticipate shifts in mood, to manage your reactions so they didn't become burdensome. You may have learned to stay useful, capable, or impressive so you wouldn't be overlooked, or to stay contained so you wouldn't provoke conflict, or to stay independent so you wouldn't need what might not be available. Each of these strategies works. They work well enough to become invisible. By the time you're older, people may describe you as mature, self-aware, reliable, introspective, strong, You might even agree with them. But beneath those qualities is a quieter truth. You didn't develop them because you wanted to. You developed them because you had to. The chart reflects this not as narrative, but as emphasis. Certain areas of life carry more weight. Certain functions are overactivated. Certain needs are deferred, minimized, or translated into something safer. For example, desire may have been redirected into responsibility, sensitivity into vigilance, vulnerability into competence, dependency into self-sufficiency. Not because those were healthier, but because they were survivable. This is why the wound is invisible. From the outside, it looks like strength. From the inside, it feels like effort. Constant, low-level effort. You may feel like you're always bracing for something that never fully arrives. Like you're holding a posture you can't relax without consequence. Like letting go would mean something important might collapse. That sense doesn't come from imagination. It comes from memory. Not conscious memory, but emotional memory. The kind that lives in the body. The kind that remembers what happened when you didn't adapt fast enough. When you needed something that wasn't met. When expression led to cost. You don't replay those moments explicitly. You live their conclusion. Astrologically, this shows up as tension between different parts of the psyche. Functions that should cooperate instead compete. One part pushing forward, another pulling back. One part craving expression, another demanding control. You feel this as internal contradiction. You want closeness, but flinch when it arrives. You want rest, but feel anxious when you stop. You want to be seen, but tighten when attention turns toward you. It's not confusion, it's protection. The wound taught you that certain states were unsafe, so the system learned to avoid them, even when circumstances change, even when the original threat is no longer present. This is why insight alone never touched it. Because insight speaks to the mind. The wound lives deeper. It lives in reflex, in the way your body tenses before your thoughts catch up. In the way you preemptively manage outcomes. In the way you assume responsibility for emotional equilibrium, even when it isn't yours to carry. You might notice that when things go wrong, you instinctively look inward. What did I miss? What should I have done differently? Where did I fail to anticipate? That reflex didn't come from humility. It came from learning that stability depended on you noticing first. The chart doesn't accuse you of this. It documents it. It shows where you learn to take on weight early, where you learn to contain intensity, where you learn to become something reliable in order to reduce uncertainty. This is why certain patterns feel so personal. They're not just habits, they're survival intelligence. And survival intelligence doesn't release its grip easily. It doesn't care that you're older now, that you have more resources, that you've grown. It operates on precedent, not possibility. That's why the wound persists quietly, shaping identity from behind the scenes. You may believe you know who you are, but much of what you call me is actually what worked, what kept things from getting worse, what minimized risk, what preserved connection, safety, or coherence when it felt fragile. That doesn't make it false, but it does mean it isn't the whole story. The unsettling realization is this: you've been living as a response, not a choice. Not because you're weak, but because the response became your baseline before you had the option to choose differently. Astrology doesn't tell you what wounded you, it shows you how you adapted. And once you see that, a new question emerges, one that doesn't offer comfort. If this identity formed to survive a specific emotional landscape, what happens when that landscape is no longer there? What happens when the strategy outlives its necessity? That's where the quiet discomfort begins to grow, because letting go of the wound doesn't feel like healing. It feels like losing orientation. The wound gave you structure. It gave you a role. It gave you a way to exist without falling apart. And beneath all your insight, a deeper part of you still believes that without it, something essential would be lost. That belief isn't irrational, it's inherited. And it's the reason awareness alone was never enough. At some point, you realized something uncomfortable. Understanding didn't save you. You could name your tendencies, trace them back, explain them in clear, intelligent language. You could see the pattern forming while it was happening and still feel unable to step out of it. That realization carries a specific kind of disappointment, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that settles in and reshapes expectations, the kind that makes you stop believing that insight automatically leads to change. You may have blamed yourself for that. You may have wondered why awareness worked for other people, but seemed to stall inside you. Why knowing your wounds didn't dissolve them. Why growth felt more like management than transformation. The truth is simpler and harder. Awareness was never designed to dismantle this pattern, because the pattern isn't a problem in the way you think it is. It's a solution. This is the part most self-help frameworks avoid. They treat patterns as errors to be corrected, bugs in the system, misalignments waiting for the right mindset. But your pattern has been doing something important. It's been protecting something deeper than comfort. Every repeating structure offers a secondary gain, not pleasure, not happiness, but stability of a certain kind, predictability, control, familiarity. The pattern gives you something, even as it costs you. It might give you the illusion of control. If you stay vigilant, if you anticipate, if you manage outcomes, you can reduce surprise. You can keep emotional chaos at bay. It might give you identity, a sense of being the responsible one, the insightful one, the strong one, the one who holds things together. It might give you moral positioning. If you are the one who sacrifices, who understands, who endures, then at least your suffering means something. At least it fits into a narrative you can live with. It might give you distance from vulnerability. If you stay in your role, you don't have to fully risk being unmet, disappointed, or exposed in ways you learned were dangerous. These gains are not trivial. They are why the pattern resists change. When you try to dissolve the pattern through awareness alone, the deeper system reacts, not with relief, but with alarm, because from its perspective, you are threatening the very structure that kept you oriented. So it tightens its grip. This is why you may notice that periods of insight are followed by regression, not because you failed, but because the system detected instability. You were moving away from what it recognizes as safe. Safety here doesn't mean comfort. It means familiarity. The chart reflects this dynamic with unsettling accuracy. Certain placements show where growth feels like risk, where expansion threatens coherence, where stepping out of role feels like betrayal of others, of identity, of something unspoken but deeply held. You may notice that whenever you try to act differently, a specific discomfort arises. Guilt, anxiety, a sense of irresponsibility, a feeling that you're letting someone down, even if you can't name who. That discomfort isn't random. It's the cost of threatening the secondary gain. The pattern protects a deeper equilibrium, one that formed when equilibrium felt fragile. And as long as that deeper layer believes danger still exists, it will sabotage attempts at surface-level change. This is why motivation never held. This is why positive reframing felt hollow. This is why even clarity didn't bring peace. You were trying to remove a structure without offering an alternative source of safety. No system allows that. Astrology doesn't tell you to abandon the pattern. It shows you why it formed and what it has been compensating for. It reveals the hidden exchange you've been making all along. You trade spontaneity for control. You trade ease for predictability. You trade vulnerability for competence. And part of you agrees to that trade every time, because the alternative still feels undefined. You might think you want freedom, but freedom without orientation feels like falling. The pattern gives you ground. This is where the false hope of awareness collapses. Knowing what you do isn't the same as knowing why you can't stop doing it. And knowing why doesn't automatically loosen the grip, because the grip isn't cognitive, it's structural. It holds together parts of you that once couldn't rely on the world to do that job. The unsettling realization is that the pattern isn't blocking your growth. It's guarding something you haven't yet learned how to protect differently. Until that deeper function is addressed, awareness will always hit a ceiling. You can see the walls clearly. You just won't be able to move them. This is why the question shifts again. Not, how do I fix this? But, what would happen if I didn't need this protection anymore? That question feels dangerous for a reason. Because the pattern isn't just something you have. It's something you are. And loosening it doesn't feel like improvement. It feels like identity loss. That's why the system resists. And that resistance isn't weakness. It's loyalty to a structure that once kept you intact when nothing else could. Understanding that doesn't free you yet, but it tells you the truth about why you've been stuck, and it prepares you for what comes next. Because the next layer isn't about healing, it's about who you've been pretending to be. At some point, the role stopped feeling like something you were doing. It started feeling like who you are. That transition was subtle. It didn't come with a decision or an announcement. It happened gradually, as repetition hardened into identity. The behaviors that once helped you navigate uncertainty became traits people expected from you, and eventually traits you expected from yourself. You didn't just respond this way, you became this way. The chart reflects this through emphasis. Certain functions grow louder. Certain expressions become dominant. Others recede into the background, not because they disappeared, but because they were never given permission to develop safely. This is how a role forms. You might recognize it in how people describe you. Reliable, insightful, intense, reserved, capable, self-contained, thoughtful, strong, mature, independent, controlled. None of those descriptions are false. They're incomplete because a role isn't a lie. It's a compression, a narrowing of expression around what worked. Over time, the role becomes efficient, predictable, safe, and deeply limiting in ways that are hard to see from inside it. You don't wake up each day and decide to play this role. You default into it. In conversations, you sense where balance is needed and move there. In relationships, you feel where tension might arise and preempt it. In work, you take on responsibility before it's assigned. In conflict, you contain rather than escalate. You do this automatically. It feels natural because it's familiar. Astrologically, this shows up as identity masks, configurations where the way you meet the world is shaped less by desire and more by necessity. The chart doesn't say you are this role. It shows that you learn to meet life through it. The unsettling part is how convincing the role becomes. You might genuinely believe that this is just your nature, that you are the type who thinks deeply, who carries weight, who doesn't need much, who can handle things others can't. There's pride in that. There's also exhaustion, because the role is always on. Even when no one is watching, a part of you stays alert, monitoring tone, monitoring impact, monitoring yourself. You might feel like you're never fully off duty, never fully unguarded, never entirely inside your own experience without also observing it. That's the cost. The role keeps you functional. It keeps you respected. It keeps you needed. It also keeps you distant from your own unfiltered impulses, from rest that isn't earned, from expression that doesn't serve a purpose. You may notice that when you imagine acting outside the role, discomfort rises immediately. Not fear exactly, more like disorientation, a sense that you'd be irresponsible, selfish, or exposed in a way that feels wrong. This isn't because the role is virtuous. It's because it became synonymous with safety. The chart often reveals this through tension between how you present and what remains undeveloped or suppressed. Parts of you that didn't fit the role were not destroyed. They were postponed. Desire postponed. Need postponed. Softness postponed. Anger postponed. Play postponed. Those parts didn't vanish. They went underground. And underground, they don't disappear. They distort. You might feel sudden resentment with no clear target, or bursts of intensity that surprise even you, or a vague sense of dissatisfaction that doesn't match your circumstances. These aren't flaws. They're signals. They're the cost of living too long inside a narrowed identity. You might also notice that you're drawn to people who express what you don't allow yourself, their impulsiveness, their emotional openness, their refusal to manage themselves for others. At first, it feels refreshing. Over time, it feels destabilizing because their freedom highlights your containment. And containment, while useful, becomes suffocating when it's mistaken for selfhood. The most uncomfortable realization is this: the role was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to get you through a specific emotional environment. But environments change. The role stayed. Astrology doesn't shame this. It explains it. It shows where identity fused with adaptation, where the line between what I do and who I am blurred so completely that questioning it feels like erasure. This is why transformation threatens you at the level of self. If you loosen the role, who are you? If you stop managing, what happens? If you don't carry the weight, does something fall apart? Or do you? These questions don't have immediate answers, and that uncertainty is exactly what the role was designed to avoid. So you keep playing it, not because you love it, but because it's coherent. The role gives you a sense of place in the world. It explains why you matter. It justifies your effort. It organizes your relationships around a function that feels indispensable. Letting go of it feels like stepping into formlessness. That's why change hasn't felt like relief. It's felt like loss. Loss of identity, loss of orientation, loss of the familiar way you know how to exist. The chart doesn't demand you abandon the role. It reveals that it is a role. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You begin to notice how often you default into it, how quickly you assume responsibility, how rarely you ask what you want without translating it into something acceptable. You begin to feel the cost more clearly, not as crisis, as quiet fatigue. The role kept you intact. It also kept you contained. And now, a deeper question is forming, not yet fully conscious, but pressing. If this role was shaped by an earlier version of danger, what happens if you keep living by it long after that danger has passed? That's not a theoretical question. It's a trajectory. And if it goes unexamined, it doesn't explode. It hardens into habit, into exhaustion, into a life that functions, but never quite opens. That is the consequence of not looking, and that is where the descent continues. There is a cost to not looking. It doesn't arrive suddenly. It doesn't announce itself as disaster or breakdown. It accumulates quietly, the way sediment settles at the bottom of water you've been standing in for too long. At first, it feels like fatigue you can manage, a sense of being tired even after rest, a low-level impatience with things that used to feel meaningful. You tell yourself it's stress, timing, a phase. You keep moving because movement has always been your solution, but the pattern doesn't dissolve through motion. It tightens. What happens over time is subtle. Your range narrows. You become more efficient, but less flexible. You know exactly how to handle what you already know, and increasingly uneasy around what you don't. Newness stops feeling like possibility. It starts feeling like risk. You may notice that you choose situations that confirm your role rather than challenge it, not consciously, structurally. You gravitate toward dynamics where your function is clear, where your contribution is needed, where the rules are familiar. This feels like stability. It is also stagnation, because the role was built for survival, not expansion. When it becomes the organizing principle of your life, it filters out experiences that don't reinforce it. You don't reject them outright. You just don't notice them, or you rationalize your way past them. Over time, something inside you goes quiet, not dramatically, not enough to trigger alarm, just enough that joy feels muted, curiosity feels impractical, desire feels inconvenient. You still feel things, but they pass through a narrow channel. You may find yourself becoming more cynical, not in a bitter way, in a knowing way. You've seen how things go. You understand patterns. You anticipate disappointment. You pride yourself on realism. Realism, here, is another form of containment, because hope requires openness, and openness is what the role was designed to regulate. If the pattern continues unchecked, life becomes a series of managed outcomes rather than lived experiences. You make choices that minimize regret rather than invite engagement. You optimize for control rather than connection. Nothing is overtly wrong. That's what makes it dangerous. The absence of crisis allows the pattern to deepen without resistance. You function well enough to avoid intervention. You succeed enough to justify the cost. You remain composed enough that no one questions your internal state, including you. Time passes like this. Years pass. And then, one day, often without warning, the weight becomes harder to ignore. Not because something terrible happens, but because nothing truly changes. You look at your life and realize it has become extremely consistent, predictable, contained, safe, and strangely lifeless in places you can't quite articulate. You may feel grief without a clear object, a mourning for something undefined, a sense that you missed something important, even though you can't point to a specific opportunity or decision. That grief doesn't come from failure. It comes from repetition without evolution. Astrology doesn't frame this as punishment or fate. It frames it as inertia. When a structure remains unexamined, it continues to do what it was designed to do, long after the original conditions have changed. The chart shows where this inertia is most likely to solidify, where time amplifies tension instead of resolving it, where unexpressed parts of the psyche slowly atrophy, not through repression, but through neglect. This is how people wake up one day and feel disconnected from their own lives. Not lost, just distant. They can explain how they got there. The logic makes sense. The steps were reasonable. The choices were defensible. And yet, the result feels wrong in a way logic can't address. You might already sense this trajectory in the way you feel older than you expected to feel, in the way time seems to accelerate without deepening, in the way you handle everything competently but rarely feel moved. The danger isn't that the pattern will destroy you. It's that it will preserve you too well. Preserve the version of you that adapted early. Preserve the role that once kept you safe. Preserve a life that works while quietly excluding what doesn't fit the structure. Unchecked, this leads to emotional calcification. Feelings become intellectualized. Longing becomes abstract. Relationships orbit function rather than intimacy. You stay involved, but not fully revealed. And because this happens gradually, it's easy to mistake it for maturity. You tell yourself you're just more discerning now, less reactive, less naive. Some of that is true. Some of it is the cost of not looking. The most unsettling consequence isn't emptiness. It's numb clarity, a state where you can see everything, understand everything, and feel very little urgency to change anything, where dissatisfaction becomes background noise, where the idea of disruption feels exhausting rather than liberating. At that point, the pattern doesn't need to defend itself. You defend it. You explain why this is just how life is, why wanting more is unrealistic, why depth is overrated, why comfort is enough. These explanations sound reasonable. They are also protective, because looking directly at the pattern requires something you've been trained to avoid: uncertainty, not the abstract kind, the lived kind, the kind that doesn't offer immediate orientation, the kind that temporarily removes the role without replacing it. If you never look, you never have to face that. You can keep functioning. You can keep succeeding. You can keep being who you've learned to be, and nothing will collapse except possibility. Astrology doesn't threaten you with catastrophe if you ignore the pattern. It shows you the likely outcome of continuity without awareness. More of the same, with diminishing returns, more insight, less aliveness, more control, less contact. That's the quiet inevitability. And if you're honest, you may already feel the early signs, not as fear, as boredom disguised as stability, as exhaustion disguised as responsibility, as a sense that time is moving and something essential isn't coming with you. This is the moment where avoidance stops being neutral. Because the longer you live inside a structure without questioning it, the more it defines what feels possible. Eventually, even imagining change feels indulgent, impractical, or dangerous. That's when the pattern fully closes, not with force, with familiarity. Looking disrupts that, and disruption, while uncomfortable, is the only thing that prevents preservation from turning into quiet decay. That is the consequence of not looking, not ruin, stasis. And that realization carries weight. Because once you sense it, staying unaware is no longer innocent. It becomes a choice, and choices have consequences, even when they are made quietly. Real change doesn't feel like relief at first. That's the first thing most people misunderstand. They imagine transformation as release, as lightness, as finally becoming free of the weight they've been carrying. But when the shift actually begins, it feels heavier, not lighter. Not because something new has been added, but because something familiar has been removed. Orientation. The pattern gave you orientation. The role told you where to stand, how to respond, what to prioritize. Even when it exhausted you, it answered the question of who you were supposed to be in any given moment. The shift begins when that answer stops arriving automatically. It doesn't happen through affirmation or intention. It happens through interruption. A moment when you notice yourself reaching for the role and pause, not because you know what to do instead, but because continuing feels false in a way you can no longer ignore. This pause is uncomfortable. There is no replacement yet, no new identity waiting to step in, just a gap where certainty used to be. Most people rush to fill it. They adopt a new framework, a new explanation, a new version of themselves that promises to be healthier, freer, more aligned. That's not the shift. That's substitution. Real change doesn't offer a new role. It removes the old one and leaves you temporarily without protection. Astrology, used properly, doesn't guide you toward becoming someone else. It shows you where the pressure has been, so you can stop mistaking pressure for purpose. It helps you recognize when you are acting from structure rather than presence. This recognition doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you when you're doing something out of habit rather than necessity. That distinction matters. You begin to notice moments where you would normally step in, manage, fix, contain, and you don't. Not because you're being rebellious or negligent, but because you're paying attention to the impulse itself. You let it pass without obeying it. The system reacts immediately. Discomfort rises, anxiety, guilt, a sense that something is wrong, unfinished, irresponsible. This is the part most people misinterpret as failure. They assume the discomfort means they're doing something wrong. It means the opposite. It means the structure is losing its automatic authority. The shift isn't about acting differently. It's about tolerating the internal consequences of not acting automatically. This requires a kind of responsibility most people never practice. Not responsibility for outcomes. Responsibility for internal disorientation. You allow the room to stay unbalanced a little longer. You allow silence where you would normally intervene. You allow others to feel what they feel without absorbing it. You allow yourself to feel uncertain without immediately translating that uncertainty into control. This is not empowerment. It's restraint. A restraint that goes against everything the pattern taught you about safety. Astrologically, this is where the chart stops being descriptive and starts being functional. You begin to work with it not as an identity, but as a diagnostic tool. You notice when a placement is activated, not to justify your behavior, but to recognize the reflex behind it. You don't say, "This is just how I am." You say, "This is where the pressure is." That subtle shift changes everything. Because pressure doesn't require obedience. It requires awareness. The more you do this, the more you realize that the pattern isn't a single thing. It's a collection of conditioned responses that activate under specific circumstances. When those circumstances are met, the system moves you into role before you have time to choose. The shift happens when you create time, not externally, internally. a pause between impulse and action that feels unnatural at first, a delay that allows something else to surface, not clarity, not confidence, but choice. Choice doesn't feel empowering in the beginning. It feels exposed, because choice means there is no script, no guarantee, no familiar justification. You are no longer protected by, "This is just how it works," or "This is who I am." You are present. Presence is the most destabilizing state for a system built on anticipation. That's why the shift feels like standing on ground that hasn't hardened yet. You don't know how things will go. You don't know how others will respond. You don't know who you'll be without the role smoothing everything out. And yet, something subtle changes. The weight begins to redistribute. You notice that certain responsibilities were never actually yours to carry. Certain tensions resolve on their own when you don't intervene. Certain relationships recalibrate when you stop managing their emotional equilibrium. Not all of them. Some fall apart. That's part of the shift, too. The pattern kept you in alignment with systems that required your containment to function. When you stop containing, those systems reveal their fragility. This can feel like loss, like failure, like proof that the role was necessary after all. It wasn't necessary. It was compensating. Astrology doesn't promise that this process will be smooth. It shows you where friction will arise when you stop playing your part, where guilt will spike, where fear will try to pull you back into familiarity. The chart doesn't soften this. It prepares you for it. Real change isn't about becoming lighter. It's about becoming more accurate. You begin to feel things more clearly, not more intensely, but more precisely. You feel when something doesn't fit without immediately explaining it away. You feel when your body tightens and ask why instead of correcting it. You feel desire without immediately asking whether it's practical or acceptable. These moments are small. They don't look like transformation from the outside. But internally, something fundamental is shifting. The system is learning that safety doesn't have to come from control, that coherence doesn't require constant management, that identity doesn't have to be earned through function. This learning is slow. It happens through repetition, not of the old pattern, but of choosing presence over reflex, again and again, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. That's why astrology matters here, not as a belief system, as a language for noticing. It gives you a way to recognize when you're acting from inheritance rather than immediacy, when you're responding to memory rather than reality, when you're confusing familiarity with truth. The shift that changes everything isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's the moment you realize you don't have to become someone else to be free. You just have to stop being who you learned to be when conditions were different. That realization doesn't bring closure. It brings responsibility. Responsibility to stay present when the role tries to return. Responsibility to tolerate uncertainty without resolving it prematurely. Responsibility to live without the guarantee the pattern once provided. This isn't destiny. It's work, not the kind that looks productive, the kind that looks like stillness where there used to be control. And in that stillness, something unfamiliar begins to emerge. Not a new identity, a space where identity doesn't have to do so much work. That space isn't comfortable yet, but it's real. And once you've felt it, the old structure no longer feels inevitable, just familiar. And familiarity, for the first time, starts to lose its authority. Living with the knowledge doesn't feel triumphant. There's no moment where everything clicks into place and stays there, no permanent sense of arrival. What changes is quieter than that, more internal, more subtle. The confusion lifts first, not because life becomes simple, but because it becomes legible. You begin to recognize what is happening while it's happening, not in a detached, analytical way, but in a grounded one. You feel the familiar pull toward the role, and you don't panic. You don't shame yourself for it. You note it the way you would note weather. There it is again. That simple recognition alters the experience. Before, the pattern carried you without asking. Now, it asks, not verbally, through sensation, through a tightening, a leaning, a familiar readiness to step in and manage. And you have enough space to respond instead of comply. Sometimes you still step in. That doesn't mean you've failed. It means the pattern is still part of your system. It just isn't the only thing operating anymore. Other times you don't. You let the silence remain. You let someone else carry what they're carrying. You let an outcome unfold without shaping it in advance. The world doesn't end. That realization settles slowly, not as relief, but as evidence. Evidence that the danger you were responding to is no longer present in the way your system believed it was. This doesn't make you softer or harder. It makes you more precise. You start to feel the difference between responsibility and compulsion, between care and control, between awareness and vigilance. These distinctions were blurred before. Now they separate naturally, without effort. You notice that rest begins to feel different, not immediately comfortable, but less charged, less earned, less conditional. You stop using exhaustion as proof of worth. You stop equating effort with legitimacy. That shift alone changes how time feels. Time stops being something you have to justify. It becomes something you inhabit. Even boredom feels different when it isn't being defended against. Your relationships begin to change as well, not because you demand more or less, but because you bring less management into the space. Some people respond to this with relief, others with discomfort. A few drift away, unable to locate you without the role they relied on. That hurts, but it hurts cleanly. There's grief in realizing how many connections were structured around your containment. How often your presence served as a stabilizing function rather than a shared experience. That grief doesn't make you want to go back. It clarifies what you're no longer willing to maintain. You also begin to notice something else, moments of unexpected aliveness. They aren't constant. They aren't dramatic. They arrive in ordinary situations, when you speak without pre-editing, when you feel a preference without justifying it, when you stop mid-response because the response no longer feels necessary. These moments feel strange at first, not euphoric, just honest. There's a sense of contact in them, with yourself, with the present moment, with something that doesn't require explanation or function to exist. You begin to trust that feeling, not as guidance, as confirmation. The chart at this stage becomes less central. You don't consult it to understand yourself. You've internalized its function. You recognize the pressures without needing to name them. You know where you tend to over-adapt, where you default into role, where you confuse familiarity with truth. The knowledge is integrated. It doesn't dominate your thinking. It informs your noticing. Life doesn't become easier in a simplistic way, but it becomes cleaner, less distorted by inherited urgency, less governed by emotional memory that no longer matches present conditions. You still feel discomfort. You still feel fear. You still feel uncertainty. The difference is that these states are no longer signals to retreat into structure. They're experiences, passing, informative, bearable. You stop asking whether you're doing life right. That question loses its grip when you're no longer measuring yourself against an internal mandate you didn't choose. You begin to live with a different kind of awareness, not hyper-awareness, embodied awareness, the kind that doesn't scan for threat, the kind that notices alignment without trying to hold it in place. You become less impressive in some ways. You stop performing coherence. You stop translating everything into insight. You stop explaining yourself preemptively. This can feel like a loss of sharpness. It isn't. It's the absence of compression. There's more room inside you now, not because you added something, but because you stopped contracting around a role that no longer needed to be maintained. That room doesn't fill itself with certainty. It fills itself with contact, with moments that don't need to be useful, with emotions that don't need to be managed, with choices that don't need to be justified beyond the fact that they're yours. You're not free of the pattern. You're free from mistaking it for identity. And that distinction changes how you move through the world. You're no longer trying to escape yourself or perfect yourself. You're simply responding to what's in front of you without dragging the entire past into every decision. That's what living with the knowledge actually looks like. Not enlightenment, not resolution. Clarity without urgency. Awareness without self-surveillance. Presence without performance. You're still shaped by what you learned early, but it no longer dictates what feels possible. It no longer decides what you must be. And that leaves you in a state that's unfamiliar, but unmistakably real, not healed, conscious. And consciousness, once integrated, doesn't announce itself. It changes how quietly you live. There is a moment that arrives quietly, after everything else has already shifted. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel like insight. It feels more like a settling, like something that was always slightly misaligned has finally clicked into place without fanfare. You realize that the question was never why you felt broken. That was the wrong frame from the beginning. Broken implies damage, failure, an interruption in something that was meant to work effortlessly. But nothing in you ever stopped working. In fact, everything worked exactly as it needed to, given what you were responding to. What you called broken was recognition without context. You were sensing the strain of carrying a structure that was never designed to be permanent. You were feeling the friction of living inside an adaptation long after its original purpose had expired. The chart didn't expose a flaw. It revealed an inheritance, an emotional architecture shaped by timing, environment, and necessity. A configuration that organized your attention, your effort, your sense of responsibility before you had the option to question any of it. You didn't fail to become whole. You became functional early. That distinction matters because once you see it, the narrative changes, not into something comforting, into something accurate. You stop asking how to fix yourself and start asking what has been asked of you for too long. And in that question, something releases, not all at once, not forever, but enough. You see how often you confused weight with meaning, how you mistook endurance for depth, how you believed that if something felt heavy, it must be important. That belief shaped your life more than you realized. Now, you notice when heaviness arrives, and instead of assuming responsibility, you pause. You ask whether this weight belongs to you, whether it's inherited, habitual, or actually required in this moment. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. That discernment is the real shift. Not freedom from structure, but freedom from confusion about what the structure is doing. You understand now that the chart never told you who you were meant to be. It showed you where you were likely to overfunction, overcarry, over-identify with roles that once kept you intact. It didn't doom you. It named the pattern, and naming the pattern changed your relationship to it. You no longer treat repetition as proof of deficiency. You recognize it as memory replaying itself, asking whether it still needs to run. Sometimes it does. Often it doesn't. You're no longer trying to erase the past. You're no longer trying to transcend it. You're living alongside it without letting it steer. That's the realization most people never reach, even after years of seeking. They look for release. They look for certainty. They look for a version of themselves that doesn't carry history. That version doesn't exist. What exists is this: a self that knows why it carries what it carries. A self that can feel the pull of old structures without obeying them. A self that understands that discomfort is not always a problem to be solved, and ease is not always a trap. You stop mistaking familiarity for truth. You stop mistaking effort for value. You stop mistaking survival strategies for identity. That doesn't make life simple. It makes it honest. And honesty, once internalized, is unsettling in a way comfort never is. It removes excuses. It removes illusions. It removes the fantasy that you were ever supposed to feel seamless or resolved. You were supposed to feel what you feel. You were supposed to recognize it. That's why the knowing doesn't bring closure. It brings vigilance of a different kind, not the hypervigilance of the wound, the quiet vigilance of awareness. You watch yourself gently now, not to correct, to notice. You notice when you default into old gravity. You notice when you stay present instead. You notice when you choose containment And when you choose openness and you understand the cost of each, the final realization isn't hopeful or dark. It's precise. You were never broken. You were patterned. And patterns don't disappear when they're seen. They lose their authority. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You've felt it in moments when nothing is technically wrong. You're standing in a room you chose, with people you invited into your life, and there's a quiet pressure in your chest that doesn't belong to the moment. Not panic, not sadness in any obvious way, just a weight, a sense that something is off, even when all the boxes are checked. You tell yourself you should be grateful. You tell yourself you've survived worse than this. You remind yourself that other people would gladly trade places with you. None of that makes the feeling leave. It never does. It shows up when things slow down, late at night, in the silence after a conversation ends, in the pause between one goal and the next. You can distract yourself for a while, but the moment you stop moving, it's there again, waiting, familiar. You don't have a clean word for it, so you call it restlessness, or emptiness, or burnout. Sometimes you tell yourself it's just your personality. Other times, you wonder if you're broken in some quiet, unfixable way. You've tried improving yourself. You've learned the language of growth. You can explain your habits, your wounds, your coping mechanisms. You know where you're supposed to be healing. You know the right insights to have. You've had them before. They didn't change much because this feeling doesn't come from not understanding yourself. It comes from recognizing yourself too well. There's a specific moment you've had more than once. You realize you're back in a situation you swore you'd never repeat. Not the same details, not the same faces, but the same emotional shape, the same dynamic, the same role. You notice it too late to stop it, and in that moment, there's a strange mix of frustration and resignation. A part of you is angry for not seeing it sooner. Another part of you feels tired, like this was always going to happen anyway. You don't talk about that part much because it threatens the story you tell about yourself. The story where you're making choices freely. The story where effort and awareness should be enough. The story where growth is a straight line forward.